So welcome everybody, and may I start with using the word wow. I did not expect for this event we would have about 500 people show up. So thank you for spending your afternoon or evening, depending on how you define it for us, in the inaugural Fireside chat with the CTO of OpenAI, Mira Murati. And this is the opening Fireside chat for SERC, which is an important pillar of the College of Computing that is about social and ethical responsibility in computing. And we have here the inaugural dean, Dan Huttenlocher, who will say more about the college. But this is one of the three important pillars of the college, which has a truly interdisciplinary goal to bring faculty and students across all 5 schools together and think about these issues, both in research, but also our goal is to have these issues addressed in every single classroom at MIT. The long-term goal is hopefully as MIT, we will be able to influence policy in this space, both in the US and hopefully worldwide. Before moving on and introducing Dan, I think I want to mention a few logistics. First, the first part, Dan is going to have a conversation with Mira, and for the first about 45 minutes. And then we invite you to go to slido.com and scan the QR code that you just saw on your screen. Use Fireside-chat-F23 to submit your questions. And Dan live would actually be discussing your questions with Mira. On that note, it is a real pleasure for me to introduce Dan Huttenlocher, who is the inaugural dean of the Schwarzman College of Computing. We actually brought him back, I should say, here from Cornell Tech, where he basically was helped found Cornell Tech, which was about digital technology and oriented to graduate school in New York City. He was the first dean and the vice provost. And he came back because he received both his master's and his PhD from MIT. So it's wonderful to be able to work with him and his deputy dean, Aswas Daglar. And before actually leaving the floor to him, I also want to introduce my partner in crime, Casper Hare, from the philosophy department, who is the other associate dean for SERC. And I also want to extend a big thank you to Corey Harris, who's been running around helping us on this, and Terry Park, Yumi, and all the people that are making this possible. On that note, I think we want to listen to Dan and Mira. Thank you, Dan.
So I'm really delighted to have this opportunity for us to speak today with Mira Murati. Thank you so much for joining us, Mira. I put together a few questions for our discussion at the beginning that were informed already by things that people in the audience had sent at the time that they registered. But let me just quickly give a little bit of a quick bio here for people, although I think you don't really need much of an introduction. So Mira is the Chief Technology Officer of OpenAI, the company behind ChatGPT and Dall-E. She leads the company's research, product, and safety teams, which work together to create safe and powerful AI that benefits humanity and has a positive impact on the world. Mira and her teams are pushing the frontiers of AI, of what AI can do, aiming to make it safer and aligning with human intentions and values. I wanted to say a little piece about Mira's career path, and I'll come back to that at the end of my questions, because I think for all of the students in the room here, it's quite interesting. So she managed the product and engineering teams at Leap Motion, led the design, development, and launch of vehicle products at Tesla, including the Model X, and also was involved in innovative programs in aerospace, and she earned her bachelor's degree in engineering from the Dartmouth Thayer School of Engineering. So with that, I thought I'd start with a few questions here. And the first thing, Mira, I just wanted to give you a chance to comment on a little bit, maybe to sort of level set the audience, was just you had quite a number of announcements this week. So maybe we'll focus on the GPT builder interface and sort of really sort of a platform for creating your own ChatGPT, including for people with no coding knowledge, although that shouldn't be a problem in this room. And sort of how you're thinking about that with respect also to paying creators for their work, since that seemed to also be a piece of what you were talking about with the GPT builder.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, that's great. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much for having me. Very excited to be here. So, yeah, as you know, we our first day event on Monday, and we announced a lot of new things on the API, but also a new product interface, like you mentioned, that we're calling GPTs. And it's really, a step in this direction of building AI agents that help us collaborate and basically teach us really how to collaborate with AI systems. And they're going to be everywhere, in our creative spaces, in our workspaces, and really, I think something that we won't be able to live without. But imagining a future where, these systems are everywhere and operate autonomously is both really amazing, but comes also with a lot of risks and trepidations. And so we need to move carefully towards that world and try to understand iteratively what it looks like and build a more robust, reliable, and thoughtful path, as it's going to have a lot of implications for society. And so we want to make sure that this journey towards a world where agents are everywhere, AI agents are everywhere, is one that allows for continuous adaptation to this technology. And so in our strategy of iterative deployment, we decided to roll out the first iteration and learn from how people are using the GPTs and what they're doing with them. And just in the first couple of days, we have seen a lot of fun and creative uses of it, a lot of attention on tools like browsing and Dall-E. So it's just all really fun to see.
So I'm gonna already go off the script of the questions I had prepared, just because when you were mentioning sort of collaboration of humans and GPTs, this is something that some of us at MIT have been spending quite a bit of time thinking about. I think often today's AI is framed sort of as AI replacing people. And if you go back all the way to 1960, long before pretty much everyone in this room except me probably was born, and including on the Zoom, I'll include you in the room, Mira. J.C.R. Licklider at MIT actually was already postulating that the real value from machine intelligence was going to be that the collaboration of humans and machines would produce results that are better than either one alone. And so I think just be great to hear your thought, since you're now really sort of starting to focus on collaborations and tools for people really collaboratively creating these interactive things. Just, is that changing your framing from sort of AI as a simulation of people to, sort of replace them, to something as a really collaborative tool where we're trying to get better outcomes than from AI by itself or people by themselves?
Yeah, I think, for a significant period of time, we're talking about collaboration with AIs, these hybrid interactions, and really using AI systems as tools to elevate us. And, in our day-to-day job, but also in our creativity. And, maybe not everyone wants to work 40 hours a week. Maybe some people want to work 5 hours a week. And so like making things like that possible that maybe before were not. But I really believe that we can have this future where for quite some time, AI systems are tools that we collaborate with. And then at some point, they will get advanced enough. And there is a question of, how exactly we interact with these AI systems and what do we want them to do and what do humans focus on. But I think for quite some time, the goal is to give people access to these tools and make it very easy to use them. And it's great if you can program, but if you cannot program, then you should just be able to program in natural language. And that's what people can do with GPTs. So we showed a demo on Monday, where a few demos actually, where just in a couple of minutes, you can program GPTs in natural language to assist you with various tasks. And that's what we want to be able to do, to bring the powers of these superpowers to humans. And anyone can just, build these tools and use their creativity. They can prototype stuff very quickly, communicate with team members, like, designers or product managers can communicate their ideas very easily to the engineering team. They can iterate very quickly. So that's sort of how I imagine the day-to-day interactions to be. And, in a way, we're already there in the way that we use ChatGPT or, Code Interpreter or Copilot that we launched a couple of years ago in collaboration with GitHub. So I think these are some good examples that give you a sense of how we're already collaborating and working with the systems. And then there is a question of, over time, how much do we delegate? And the nature of the tasks possibly becomes more and more abstract. But for now, I think we're really automating the part of that's kind of repetitive of our tasks, and also helping using these tools to help with brainstorming, or usually I define it as like the first step of any particular thing that you're doing, whether you're an accountant or analyst or a consultant or a designer. It's really that like first step that these AI systems can be quite helpful with today.
Great, thanks. So I'm going to go to some of the things that came in beforehand from people in the audience, and I had a chance to review and try to kind of group together in some quasi-coherent way. So, so we seem to be in a world of, sort of AI optimists on one extreme and AI pessimists on the other. Where do you place yourself in that, and how does that affect your leadership at OpenAI?
I'm definitely optimistic in general, and I think it's very important to have a sense of possibility and optimism, because, things have a sense of being self-fulfilling as well. And it's important to have belief and faith that things are going to go well, but I'm not saying that one should be optimistic blindly. And with that optimism comes also, a large degree of preparation and being quite, I'd say, clear-eyed and open-eyed about all the challenges ahead. And there's, a set of immediate, urgent challenges that we're facing as we're releasing these technologies and trying to make them as accessible as possible. But also, predicting the capabilities and risks as we're preparing to train more and more capable models. And I think the foundational thing, kind of in the medium term, is really building the science of prediction. And we did this with GPT-4. And we're betting more and more on this, understanding how to predict the capabilities of the models that we are building. And with that, also preparing for red teaming, preparing for the risks ahead and how to mitigate the risks that are brought along with more powerful capabilities. And it's sort of like, I'd call that like kind of medium-term risk, or as we go from urgent things to more long-term capabilities. And then in the far end, of course, we're facing questions around catastrophic risk and, these systems that are self-improving and extremely capable. And so how do we get ahead of that? What do we need to understand? What kind of research do we need to be doing today to be prepared for this unknowns? And we've, at OpenAI, we've invested quite a bit in what we call super alignment. And so it's this idea of doing a lot of research to understand how we align these very capable, increasingly capable models that eventually become, AGI or ASI eventually. And this is a extremely hard technical challenge. And we're investing quite a bit from compute perspective, but also in terms of just hiring a great team of researchers and giving them space to focus on some of these very uncertain and difficult research agendas.
So in terms of, given the importance of prediction, given the importance of being able to predict risks that you were talking about, do you have, to share with people who are sort of not involved in, what you're doing inside the company, sort of examples of things where, either you were, surprised one way or the other in terms of your either ability or inability to predict risks, and sort of how should the world at large think about risk prediction and how well that works?
Yeah, so, if you think about GPT-4, it was a brand new frontier model a year ago, and we did very precise capability predictions ahead of time. We put in 6 months of work into safety before releasing, doing a lot of red teaming, doing a ton of evaluations, and then we proceeded to do this very controlled deployment where we rolled out to a set of trusted users, understood what they were able to do and what some of the risks of that were. And then over time, as we built more confidence about being able to handle the risks and mitigating them, we broadened up access to more and more users. But yeah, I think in terms of our core safety decision has been really building the science of prediction and following this strategy of iterative deployment. Before we even released big models, so let's say GPT-3, for example, we had been studying misinformation for a really long time, and but we didn't have, first-hand experience with it because we had never deployed such models. And so before we released GPT-3, we were extremely worried about the effects that it could have on elections and just misinformation at large on the internet. And not that that's not important, that's extremely important. But what we saw from actual deployment was that a much bigger risk was, spamming content, which is, still bad, but perhaps not as bad and not exactly what we expected. So we kind of reoriented our work then to be to focus on those mitigations. But I would say, a lot of the things that we're dealing with right now, in terms of risks, to some degree, we had thought about and had predicted them many, many years ago, like let's say even 4 or 5 years ago, but you don't know exactly the degree to which the problem will be pervasive, important, critical, and how precisely it will impact things. Like, for example, education is something that, we knew GPT-4 and ChatGPT would have some effect, but we didn't know exactly how. So we started studying provenance of content and being able to detect what's AI generated, what's not AI generated. But we don't understand, the impact that these technologies are having on the education system and how things will evolve over time. And so we know there is some sort of impact, but we don't know exactly what, how, and so it's very important to actually continuously study this and be able to react and be able to kind of iterate on the strategy, on the technology, work with different parts of society that are affected by it, and figure out some ways to gather input, not just from people that use the technology, but also people that are affected by it and are not necessarily using it. So it is quite complex in that sense, because, you need to coordinate so many aspects. It's a technology that affects everything. It's such a fundamental unit of things and changes the fabric of society. So it's, it's like a global coordination task. It's just a really huge task.
And so maybe this is pertinent to the education space. I had thought about it as a broader question before based on what people said, but like, what role do you see? It's a lot to take on in addition to developing these models and testing these models and predicting things, to really think through impact in various different domains. To what degree do you see, collaborating with academia or with other kinds of organizations who might be able to do things like help study how these things are being used and can be used in K-12 education or in other places? Are those things that you're looking to do to sort of build, either with other companies, sort of non-competitive consortia, or with academia to study some of these broader kinds of questions, to give you sort of a broader platform for thinking about risk?
Yes, for sure. I mean, we of course have a lot of responsibility as developers of the technology, but it's not really possible for a small group of people in an organization to figure out how technology will be absorbed by society and the entire infrastructure that needs to be built to make this, just really beneficial to everyone. And so I think one of the big benefits of ChatGPT was really bringing AI, the effects of AI and the experience of AI in the collective consciousness. Because before then, I think people obviously had a sense, but not everyone could just experience the power of these very advanced AI systems and know what it feels like. And I think that had an incredible effect, because people weren't just reading about it or hearing about it. They could just feel it, experience it for themselves. And I think this really pushed governments all over the world into action to think about how to coordinate, organize, govern AI systems. And we've seen actually a ton of movement in the past year. Last week, the UK AI summit was held, where all the major AI developers were there, and thinking about, voluntary commitments that organizations can make. And so I think this is a really inflection point for AI governance. And that's because it has sort of penetrated the collective consciousness. And there was an important moment. Now, when it comes to our role and how we work with various organizations, civil society, academia, and so on, we try to do as much as possible. And we collaborate with organizations like Code.org or Khan Academy, and try to empower them to build with our technology, get their feedback. And they were helping us understand some of the very early use cases around AI tutors, and how to make them effective. And we got the feedback from educators, but now we're also working with a few universities just to understand how it affects things in the classroom, especially with ChatGPT. And so there is quite a bit of work that we're doing with various organizations, and I think there's obviously always more that we can do. But our priority is really to just make it accessible, easy to use, and to really just empower everyone to be able to use the technology and start thinking about how it impacts their specific domain, as we don't necessarily have expertise, say, in the domain of education, but we want to give people the tools to experience and understand it for themselves and, be able to gather that feedback and make the technology more robust or more helpful.
So with the race to develop and release larger models, how do we stop this from sort of becoming a race to the bottom on safety concerns? You sort of mentioned things like, the recent Bletchley Park people getting together and talking about this, but when realities of competition come to bear, often these things can be good intention. Somebody I've learned a lot from in my life likes to say good intentions without mechanisms don't actually get anything done. So how do you think about mechanisms there for that?
Yeah, there are a few things. Well, one, I'd say this is why we spend a lot of time thinking about the structure of OpenAI, sort of anticipating a future where things would get quite competitive and AI would just have a very important place in the economy. And so we kind of change the structure of OpenAI into this limited partnership, which is still governed by the nonprofit, but it allowed us to then, raise money so we could buy the supercomputers to be able to do our research and our work. But it's still governed by the nonprofit, and it has a limited cap, what we call limited profit cap, and so that ensures that the primary objective is really achieving the mission, which is building AGI that really benefits all of humanity. And the structure, the mechanisms, the incentives are important. They're not everything, but they're really important. And so I'll start with that. But then I think, as we're deploying things, it's also very important to make sure that we get the things around governance right. And so right now there's a lot of debate around regulation, and we've been pushing for regulation of frontier systems that don't necessarily affect, the startups or innovation of small companies and so on, but put some sort of degree of checks and balances and regulatory framework around models that are really at the frontier, and encouraging the government to think about regulating these models that have incredible capabilities. In the near term, I'd say, at OpenAI, we just have a whole set of things that help us think about how to deploy safely and responsibly. And it's not really a one-stop. It's not just something that you add at the very end. It's something. It's integrated from the data, from point of view of the data into the algorithms, into building the product, into actual deployment, and looking at how people are using the AI, and then feeding it back into the technology, and having this full loop that we continuously iterate on. And that's really important, and also providing some accountability by, whenever we release some new technology, we have safety systems squared. We do a lot of red teaming. Often we publish the outcomes of the red teaming. And so I think, it's important for the industry to have some sort of standards around deployment. And what we have seen, I would say, in the past couple of years, is that there is a lot of voluntary standard setting from the big companies. We saw this a bit with the White House commitments as well. But yeah, it's important to avoid kind of this race to the bottom. And I'd say, that's very important. And if we just focus on sort of the worst outcomes, I would focus on, if we have to focus on one thing and like the worst outcomes, I would focus on the frontier systems and being able to work with governments and other AI developers to regulate the frontier models.
So, it's the executive order that the Biden administration put out a couple weeks ago. Certainly, I mean, it has a lot of breadth to it, but part of it is definitely looking at foundation models and what they term dual-use foundation models that can have sort of potential defense kinds of uses, you know. And how are you thinking about that executive order and how it's affecting what you're doing? Because it has reporting requirements and other things. How are you thinking about and preparing for those?
Yeah, it's pretty fresh. So we're studying and looking at it and seeing, you know, what it actually means in practice and what the effect of it would be. But generally, I'm very supportive of figuring out the appropriate regulation around frontier models. I think it's valuable to think of it in terms of capabilities and, you know, building the science of predicting these capabilities and determining any thresholds or regulation based on that. But this is just all very fresh, and you know, internally we're looking at this and we're figuring out what it means and how to make sure that it's something that's practical. You know, you don't want regulation and the actual science of doing things or the practical actions to be detached. So I'd say the short answer is that, you know, we're still reviewing it, but on principle, yeah, we definitely have been encouraging having some sort of regulatory framework around frontier models.
So there's another piece of that executive order that I'll sort of summarize in the following. I mean, it's long, but I'll summarize it as, you know, using AI is not an excuse for, you know, breaking existing regulations and laws. So that, you know, if you make your frontier model available and somebody else uses it in a way, or either uses or misuses it in a way that's, you know, counter to other existing laws or regulations, it's sort of not an excuse. Do you see that as something that exposes you all to risk in terms of how people use things? Do you think that, you know, that's a part of the responsibility of these very general models is to have guardrails in there that actually help guard against misuse, you know, like somebody pretending to be a lawyer or pretending to be a doctor by sort of, you know, kind of consulting a generative model, or those things that you think fall within scope? How do you see sort of teasing apart in some sense the amazing capabilities of these general models and then the ways that they may be used for very good purposes, but also misused in a lot of different domains, and how the responsibility there kind of shakes out?
Yeah, so I think it's very sort of domain specific, use case specific. Like, of course, there's some common sense guidelines and guardrails around, you know, what's legal and what's not legal. But a lot of it, like a lot of the hard decisions and the nuanced decisions are quite detailed. Like, for example, you have to think, you know, how let's say, how is a lawyer using an AI system? And you go through the use cases, the various use cases, and you try to understand. And like right now, for example, there is human oversight. So it's not like you're delegating all the decision making to an AI system. And there is human oversight, what we call human in the loop. And, you know, that we came up with sort of that usage guideline by understanding how people were actually using the system and where the gaps were, where the concerns were for us. And we go through this entire process where we work very closely, especially when it comes to opening up a new domain or a new capability. then we will work very closely with trusted partners to understand precisely how they're using it, where the risks are. And generally, especially, with enterprise customers, they do have an incentive for the technology to be robust, reliable, useful. Otherwise, even from a business perspective, it's not very useful if it cannot really follow the intent, if it's not reliable, if it's not robust. And so there is this very good incentive alignment. And we learn a lot. We share the tools, the safety tools, monitoring tools, any systems that we build to be able to empower other people to establish their own guardrails on top of the model guardrails or the product guardrails that we put in place. We also share those with our developers and with our customers at large. So I think it's quite specific. It really depends. Like these questions are going to get harder and harder over time, obviously, but I'd say it really depends on the use case. It depends on the domain. It depends on the capabilities of the models where you sort of draw the line.
Thanks. So another area of question that I know you're very familiar with is there are a number of creative professionals who are concerned about ChatGPT and their intellectual property rights. But at the same time, there are also creatives who are very excited about using generative models like ChatGPT and Dall-E. So how are you thinking more generally about respecting rights of creators and authors? And it certainly seems like at least a piece of the recent ChatGPT builder announcement was sort of maybe one step in that direction of starting to think about how you might share revenue with people who put their creative talent into building customized GPTs. Mm-hmm. But what about all of that other creative material that's out there that's being used by these models?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in building the Dall-E models, most recently Dall-E 3, we're working with a lot of licensed data, we've worked very closely with creators to actually get their feedback on how to develop the product and how to make it most useful, and also just think about and iterate on data sharing, data contributions. There is this whole area of how do you attribute value to specific data that's sort of contributed into model training. That's a difficult technical question. And then as we address that, or while we're addressing that, we also want to think about the economics of, sharing the benefits of these models with the creators. So we're doing quite a bit of work there with, publishers, with creators, and then with the GPTs that we just announced, we're going to have a marketplace soon where people can publish their GPTs and be compensated. We're figuring out the details of this, but this is quite nascent, and we're basically just getting very involved with creators and getting a lot of feedback from people on what would make sense, what would be valuable. And there is the aspect of getting input and figuring out economic models, but there is also this aspect of understanding data attribution. It's a bit of a challenging technical problem that we've been working on. So I think there's a lot to do here, but I expect this to evolve and to change a lot. Our goal is definitely to figure out ways to compensate creators, or at least put people in the driver's seat to choose if they don't want their data to be used for training models. And so we've done a lot of work in data privacy and user controls to try to give people, as much control and as much say as possible to figure out, if they don't want their data to be used for training.
Great. So I'm going to switch gears now to some of the audience questions that have come in. So one One question is, OpenAI's mission is to create AGI that benefits all of humanity. How can young people like us, and obviously I'm quoting the audience, not myself, how can young people like us build this future? What engineering challenges and problems stand in our way?
There's so many engineering challenges and even bigger challenges that are sort of at the intersection of many domains. A lot of the interesting problems that I see right now is sort of like they're frontier problems when it comes to building the technologies, and also a lot of problems that sit at the intersection of many things, like societal impact, technology, safety, the legal frameworks. We're changing everything, and we need people to really think about how to evolve and change essentially all these different domains and build the infrastructure for society to be able to adopt and use this technology in a way that's very beneficial. So in a way, I think, I don't know, perhaps it's the most exciting moment in history to do really important and impactful work that's really going to shape the way that we live and the quality of our life in the future.
Great, thank you. So OpenAI is clearly leading in the domain of natural language processing and also the image. I'll make an editorial comment because I think also image synthesis. But does OpenAI have any plans to lead in other domains of AI? And then, in particular, and the question was applications, video generation, use in biology. There's certainly a lot of interest around MIT and some other educational institutions in generative AI for scientific discovery, with biology as one example. Are those places that, where you're also looking at applications in other domains, or are you sort of focused on the frontier models in natural language and in vision?
So the way that we think about it is, what's the most likely path to safe and beneficial AGI? And so we kind of build our research agenda around that. And of course, a big bet that we made a few years ago was on scale, large language models and scaling those models. This was a very significant paradigm shift at the time. And now we're looking at basically bringing together a lot of modalities into these large models. And so we want a lot of data, and we want different modalities, and we want to continue to be able to scale the systems over time. And so when you're thinking about modalities, I'm sure you've seen our text-to-speech model, but we're looking at everything, whether it's images or voice or video. So we're kind of working on all these different modalities. And then in terms of applications, there is certainly the work that we've been doing with ChatGPT and our first-party product, and we really want to bring these technologies into the platform so other people can build with them as well. That's extremely valuable. And I'd say we're not necessarily investing in a specific domain like biology, unless there is some very good strategic reason to do so. We're not experts in biology. And so typically we would work with a company that has expertise or an institution that has expertise in another domain, and we bring our own to figure out what's possible at the frontier of some new domain. That's how we normally do it. And in terms of scientific advancements, I think that's very interesting, and it's one area that I'm personally very excited about, seeing how these AI systems will help us basically just figure out new things and discover new things. And internally, of course, we've been using Copilot-like systems, and we have systems to help us with, say, safety monitoring, and these are based on GPT-4. So we're already using GPT-4 like systems to help us with various aspects of our work. Like a notable example is definitely in building safety infrastructure and monitoring. But I think over time this will evolve more and more, and maybe you can imagine having an AI scientist that runs on GPUs and helps us advance research and helps us do alignment research. In fact, it's one of our core research agendas for alignment, building sort of this AI alignment researcher. So I think, this in particular is something that we're very excited about. And you could extend that to other scientific domains, of course.
Great. So these are just like, I tried to organize the other questions. So these ones have not been organized, but they're all quite interesting, not surprising given the audience. Do you have thoughts or comments on human out-of-the-loop systems, like fully autonomous multi-agent generative AI systems that don't involve any sort of human oversight or collaboration?
Yeah, obviously these kind of systems would be very powerful, and you can imagine them being extremely useful. I mean, even in just in the use case that we just discussed, if you're doing scientific research or any engineering work, you go to sleep and you have got your AI collaborators continuing to do that work. Imagine how quickly things could advance. But of course, the challenge there is making sure that these systems are aligned and they're following intent, and not just explicit intent, but implicit and sort of high-level ambiguous intent, and making sure that they're really aligned with what you want them to do. That is the challenge. And that's something that we've been working on for a while. We started with RLHF, and we built instruction following models with RLHF, and there was kind of probably the first time that we saw safety into production, into these real world products, and we brought safety research into real world products. And then after that, obviously we continued this work with ChatGPT and extended it further. We did a lot of alignment work with GPT-4, and GPT-4 was the most aligned and most powerful model at the time. So I think if we just kind of proceed in this path where we continue to do a lot of alignment research and capability prediction work, build up the science of prediction, and continue to develop and deploy iteratively, learning from every step while the stakes are still low, I think there is a path to getting to a place where these autonomous agents can be robust and safe. But there are a lot of research questions ahead of us that we need to figure out and answer.
When you mentioned RLHF there, I guess I had a follow-up question, which is, have you been using reinforcement learning with AI feedback, like just in terms of the challenges of scaling human feedback? And if so, are you finding that useful? Like sort of how do you look at the scale problems of alignment and sort of humans in that feedback loop?
Yeah, that's, the hiring a lot of contractors and giving them direction initially after GPT-3, that was very important in building the instruction following models. But of course, with ChatGPT, then our intention was to have this as a research preview and get a lot of feedback from the research community, and use that feedback for RLHF or generally to just make the model better and more robust and more reliable. But of course, in 4 days, we saw 1 million users. And so this opened up a new opportunity, which was, now all of a sudden, if users were willing to, we could use that input for RLHF. And so that's very valuable data flywheel. And of course, we had to make sure that users were willing to provide such input and give them the controls to decide for themselves. But in terms of scalability, that is one path where you have access to a large user base. But more importantly, perhaps, is also the quality of the data and making sure that the quality of the data is high. So that generally requires very specific data collection campaigns. And there is a lot of work that us and also I think a lot of other AI developers are doing on high quality data collection.
Great. So on the education topic, there's been and you mentioned code.org. There's been a big push for students to learn to code in recent years. If we're really able to code in natural language, how do you see the change in K-12 education? Do you see, how do you see sort of the human coder with a co-pilot, the non-human coder? Like, what should we be thinking about in terms of at least K through 12 education and trying to get kids to code?
There is, a lot of code to be written in the world. And so I think for people that want to learn, it's just a great opportunity. I don't think it's going away anytime soon. And I think it's great to be able to learn and build things yourself. Now, the technologies we're building make it much easier both to actually learn how to code and make sure that it's catered to the way that you think, and you can just ask so many questions. The system is just running on GPU, so it's quite patient, and it will you can the learning can be quite personalized and catered to you, which can be very effective. But at the same time, it's also these systems are far more accessible than ever. And so if one just wants to code in natural language, they can also do that, where they provide sort of high-level guidance to GPT or other systems like it, and can build prototypes or actual products with very little coding language. So I think it's becoming both much easier to learn, probably easier than ever, and much easier to build. All these tools are accessible, available, and so people just need to explore. And if they're curious, all the tools are at your hands.
So one of the questions that's been rising in popularity here, somebody asked it, is are OpenAI and MIT thinking about a partnership that could benefit the MIT community? So obviously there are a lot of students here who are interested in in your tools and your engagement with places like MIT.
I am open to your proposals.
Good. We'll be back. I know there have been some discussions going on that I'm aware of, but I'm not sure that any of them are that far along at this point. So, and there's certainly a lot of sort of point-wise interactions between various faculty and research groups at MIT and folks at OpenAI. But I think it just shows the level of broad student interest in what you're doing and how they can really become expert in it.
Amazing.
When it was lower down on the list, I would have ignored it, but it went all the way up to the top. So there's a set of questions here sort of around, mechanisms to help ensure, sort of fairness, combating bias, sort of ethical development of technology. You've spoken quite a bit to some of those kinds of questions more broadly, but are there specific things maybe that the fact that there's still questions coming up, my guess is people are hoping there might be something that's a little bit, a concrete example or something there in terms of mechanisms that you see that are working in the work that you're doing.
Yeah, there's certainly, I mean, we're doing so much work in this, whether it's in text or images, combination of all these things. So I'm thinking through the work that we did with Dall-E recently. Dall-E is definitely the most advanced image system out there. And we had to do quite a bit of work in making sure that, we'd mitigate some of the harmful biases within the system, but also, you have to get the balance right with mitigating biases, with figuring out how, let's say, you don't want to necessarily optimize too much for engagement because you end up with other issues. And so once you optimize one metric, you can see a lot of other things degrading. And so one thing that we've learned is that whenever you're optimizing for one thing, you have to be super careful because probably a bunch of other things that you didn't expect would be degrading. And so you have to take a very holistic view, especially with very complex issues like harmful bias, and constantly be auditing the system end to end when you tweak something. And so we've seen this a lot. There was, I think with Dall-E 2, we tweaked something when it came to the ratio of gendered images. And then we ended up with some result that we didn't expect, that a lot of the images of women were sort of hypersexualized because that was the content in the data. So then we had to go in and intervene again and make sure that it was more balanced and we were not ending up with these unintended consequences. So these issues are very complex and they require having quite diverse talent in the team to be able to handle them, and doing a lot of red teaming with people from with different expertise, because we learn a ton from that early red teaming, initially with trusted users and then with a broader set of people, and be constantly intervening and tweaking, but at almost like all stages, from data to the algorithm itself, to the way that we deploy the technology in the product and the way we design the product, the access around it, as well as the post deployment. So figuring out stuff around like classifiers, monitoring, usage policies, and things like that. So yeah, I'd say Dall-E is probably a great example of this. A lot of examples around our base model on ChatGPT. So where, we have our usage policies, and then we build systems that help us monitor and like automatically monitor according to our usage policies. And sometimes, we have over refusals because we're being too conservative. And that's kind of annoying for the user. It's not so much fun, and the system hedges a lot. So we have to optimize for that, perhaps collect more data, higher quality data, better data, and intervene again. So we have to do tweaks like that. And in some cases, there is kind of this trade-off between truthfulness and factuality and like creativity, or the personality of the model, like it being fun and creative. And so this is actually quite a hard balance to strike between creativity and factuality, perhaps even in humans. And so this is something that we've learned a lot about in the past year and have iterated a lot on. And also people have different expectations or preferences. And so we introduce custom that puts people more in charge of kind of the personality of the model and how the model behaves within certain bounds and guardrails, of course. But yeah, I'd say these are probably some of the things we've learned, some of the things we've done over the past year in these different models.
No, that's great. I think that's some of the kind of next level down things that help people understand a little more. So another question that's been voted way up, and I'm going to read the question, but I'm going to presume it's been voted way up for part of the question. The question is, as a member of the MIT Albanian Association, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you ended up where you are today and any advice you may have. I presume that some of the people voting that up just want to hear about your career and aren't all members of the MIT Albanian Association, but maybe we have a big contingent who came to hear you today, but probably not hundreds of them. So, but anyways, I think people would love to hear a little bit, and this will kind of get to one of the questions I had also, just how you got to where you are, what your thoughts about careers are. On the one hand, you're way past being an undergraduate, but on the other hand, you've had a sort of very rapid rise in the kind of responsibilities for things that you're doing. So it'd be really great to hear your thoughts on career advice.
So yeah, I grew up in Albania, and I then studied. I did my high school in Canada, or half of my high school, at United World College in Canada, and then I came to the US for college. But I've always been interested in math and science, and I was always interested in kind of just building stuff. And I studied mechanical engineering. I studied math and mechanical engineering, and eventually, right after school, ended up working in aerospace and then in automotive, where I learned a lot about how to build complex things. You're talking about, very complex systems with thousands and thousands of parts, and everything comes together: software, hardware, electrical engineering, regulation, everything comes together there. And in terms of the career path, I never really had a very specific plan. In terms of, I didn't have a specific plan of where I wanted to end up, but I always kind of followed my curiosity and always wanted to just build things. And I wasn't afraid to jump domains. So after building a lot of expertise and knowledge in a specific domain, I wasn't afraid to just kind of start from scratch. And I've done that a few times in my career. So, in aerospace, and then going to automotive, and then going to virtual reality and augmented reality and more computer vision and AI work. And then obviously, in the past 5 years, into working in AI and really being dedicated to AGI. So there is something there, but I also think that's quite specific to how I learn and, the things that I'm interested in. And usually I'm interested in the intersection of many things, technology that sort of affects many things, and working at the intersection of many domains. But generally, that would be my advice, to just do really the thing that you're most curious about and most excited about. I think it's kind of, maybe people hear this a lot, but it's really true. And because when things get hard, then it doesn't feel like work. And things will inevitably get hard. And so I would say, especially earlier in your career, but perhaps always just focus on learning and maximizing your learning and the things you're curious and excited about.
No, I actually think it's great advice. You were saying it's maybe just how you are, but I would say, I think often people focus a little too much on sort of a linear career path and trying to plan it out. And I think, when you said you didn't really think about a goal, you thought about the moment and really learning what you could learn and doing what you could do in that moment. I think you constrain your opportunities by trying to think about the linear path. So I think your career and your attitude is something that everybody should hear. And I could sort of see it from the set of things you'd worked on. So I'd sort of already written a question about this, but I'm glad it came up. So this is related, but maybe different enough that, so just general advice you have for aspiring entrepreneurs and innovators about what to do in their early 20s. So it's getting a little more specific. And then maybe especially for people who are from a minority background.
I mean, I would say for everyone, just especially right out of school, it's so much easier to take risks and just try things. It's like the best thing to learn about what you want, what you will enjoy, what you'll be good at, is to really try and build stuff, make things, like really make things, and try as many things as possible. And I think that really gives you a sense of taste about what you want to do and what you're good at. And it also helps evolve your taste, whether it's in research or, any domain. It doesn't really matter. But yeah, I'd say it sounds generic, but I really think it's the best advice to really just go do stuff and not really overthink it, especially like that early in your career where, you don't have a ton of built up expertise. And so the opportunity cost may not be as high. I think the best thing to do is to just go make things and try things and build things.
So this is another question that's related to something I'd written before, so it's good. My questions had overlap. What actions are being taken at OpenAI to address the environmental impact of the AI systems, the extremely large amount of GPU compute resources being used in the training, and then of course, as they're integrated in society in the long term, also a lot of aggregate inference. Like right now, maybe the training's using most of the compute power, but as you start to integrate these into society broadly, it certainly becomes both.
The specific action that we're taking is making the systems more efficient. But yeah, I'd say, in general, we work with Microsoft that's really thinking about how to offset some of the impact of this. But longer term, what I'm really excited about is getting these advanced systems to help us figure out maybe either new scientific solutions to dealing with climate change, or perhaps just figuring out the infrastructure of more sustainable energy and making that just really the default way of consuming energy, consuming energy. And this is something that I'm particularly excited about, figuring out how to use advanced AI systems to help us deal with these extreme challenges that, just left to our own devices, we haven't really figured out, and they're not exactly on track, I would say, to solve on our own. So I'm hoping that, medium to long-term AI can help us with that. But in the near term, we're working on things like figuring out how to optimize data centers and the design of data centers, and also working with Microsoft on that, and also just making the systems more and more efficient.
So here's a different form of question. Thanks for that one. Do you agree with the prediction that having a job will be optional in the future?
It depends how far in the future. But yeah, if you look far enough into the future, possibly, yes.
But you don't see it as a short to medium term thing.
Maybe not in the next 10 years, let's say.
Yeah. Well, and I'm sure you're doing the work of at least several people right now in your job, so it's probably hard to think about jobs being optional where you're sitting right now. So 100 years from now, how do you think people will look back on OpenAI? What do you want OpenAI's impact on the future and humanity to be in that sort of timescale?
100 years is a really long time.
You can pick a shorter one. I'm just reading the question.
It was hard to predict what was going to happen this year. We didn't predict the ChatGPT moment. But, looking far enough into the future, I'd hope that at the very least, OpenAI has had a crucial impact in helping society build AI systems in a way that's safe, and we figure out how to distribute the benefits of AI systems to everyone. And so whether it's OpenAI that has figured that out or led the work or inspired people to do that, I think that's great. But the end impact, like really figuring out how the path to safe and aligned advanced AI systems. And in addition to that, I would say also inspiring or helping drive innovative and practical ways to good global governance of AI systems. I think that's a huge challenge, and a lot of governments and nations have sort of become very aware about this challenge and are trying to coordinate in different ways, through the UN or various global summits. And I think this is incredibly important, and I hope that OpenAI helps to get this right.
Thank you. How do you think about the role of open academic research with respect to sort of leading generative AI models? So in the early days of OpenAI, you were fairly active in publishing in the more open academic literature. And more recently, that's less the case, and not just for OpenAI. As this has become a more competitive space, companies that were sort of part of an open research community for very understandable reasons have been starting to do that less. But how should we think about the role of open academic research and the importance of that in the advancement of things in this area?
Yeah, so first of all, we still try to do open research in areas where we can, or when we have systems that we can open source and the larger community can benefit from them and do so in a way that we consider to be safe, we do that. So we've open sourced elements of Dall-E 3, and we've open sourced our Whisper system. And when we look at what we can open source, I know this is a heated debate currently, open sourcing versus not. But I think the question is really, how do you think about alignment, safety, second, third degree consequences of releasing the systems, and what happens once they're released? Because once they're open source, we don't have we can really enforce guardrails. And with GPT-4, for example, we spent a really long time figuring out the guardrails and around the system and how to make it safe and how to deploy it safely. And we've continued to build and invest in the infrastructure. And so I think these are very important questions, not to be taken lightly. But in terms of open academic research, it doesn't have to be all centered around building large models. We want to make them easily accessible. And when it comes to these large models, and for specific purposes, like, for example, figuring out risks or understanding capabilities, we do a lot of close work with experts, like, for example, in misinformation or bio or whatever things we're worried about when we're developing a new model. And we give them more access than we'll give, a general user or customer, because we want them to really understand the capabilities and risks of the model. So I think this is a really important way to contribute with understanding the capabilities of the risks of the models, especially when it comes to certain domains, like, when we're thinking about cybersecurity risk or bio risk or misinformation when we're developing new models. I think these are important areas to collaborate or or figuring out even just new research directions. Like, for example, we have funded a lot of safety research recently, and both through OpenAI and also in a few collaborations through the AI Safety Summit. So I think there are a ton of opportunities for actually advancing open academic research, and it's just about doing so in ways that are not sort of undermining the colossal amount of safety work that we're doing when it comes to developing and deploying large language models.
Great. So there's two threads there that I'd like to pick up on. The first was, you mentioned about open source, and one of the questions here had been, are there any steps that can be taken, whether by companies like OpenAI or governments or others, consumers even, so that technology that is open sourced in the generative AI realm isn't modified for malicious purposes?
We're actually doing some research on this right now, but I don't have anything novel to share. But I think, the bottom line is that it's really hard. Once you're open sourcing these models, you don't really have control over them anymore. But we are doing some research on it, because clearly there is also a lot of appetite to have access to these technologies, and it's completely understandable. So we've been doing some research for a few months now to figure out this question, and it's pretty challenging. We'll probably have something to share next year, I think.
It's great to know you're thinking about that. I know others are as well, but as you said, it's a really tough problem. So let me see. I knew I had a second question from that. I forgot. Should have. It wasn't one of the ones that was in the list. So another one from the list is, do you see OpenAI branching out into more embodied AI? So that, robotics, other things where...
Not in the next year.
Not
in the future, but no, I don't think in the immediate term, we're not thinking about robotics. We are thinking about, I'm sure you've seen sort of, speculation in the news, and thinking about device integration. And so on, like thinking about what this future with AI systems could look like, and what future devices could look like. But that's just really, very early thinking, and nothing really concrete to share.
And then there's a lot of interest in sort of explainability of these models.
Yeah.
And sometimes some of us like to say interpretability, because explainability sometimes suggests the model can explain itself, which is maybe a higher bar even than being interpretable by people. Are those, what are you doing looking at those kinds of problems?
Actually, Alexander Mandry from MIT joined us recently to help us think about these problems, and actually, supercharge the research around interpretability and generally the science of predicting capabilities as well. Obviously, some work that we've done is actually ended up in ChatGPT, but it started as understanding, improving the truthfulness and the factuality of these models, and understanding what was happening. So having some sort of dialogue interface to get a sense of what was happening with the models. And it ended up, after a few iterations of research, and how research evolves, it ended up into ChatGPT. But initially, they started with this question of, how do we understand what is happening with these models? And Socratic dialogue is a good way to even, understand what students are thinking about, or how well they understand the subject, or your colleague, or so on. This is how we kind of communicate and get a sense of, even in interviews, how much expertise someone has in a given subject. And so then there is a question of how much you can trust that, and hallucinations and other problems. But it does give you some insight when you have this ability to interact with the model in a way that we interact with each other. So I think that is interesting, and the work that we've started with our super alignment team doing on interpretability and new research that we are seeding in this direction, but it's still really quite early.
Great, thank you. So there are way too many questions here. So I'm going to stop for a second and just say, in this whole long list of questions, I feel like we're giving you an oral exam or something, one question after another. So what have we not asked that we should have? Is there anything? Nope. All right. So that's good. So, do you have any question you would like to ask us? Because otherwise, with that, I think there's no way I'm going to get through this list. So we're going to run out of time. But I thought I'd see if there's any question you think we should have asked, or any question you'd like to hear from the collective audience here.
I think we covered quite a broad range. I hope it was helpful.
Yeah. So, but we really appreciate your time, Mira, and your thoughtful answers to all of our questions. As you can see, there's a huge amount of interest here at MIT in what you all are doing and in engagement with OpenAI, and we look forward to continue to work with you all. Thank you very much. We really appreciate your time.
Thank you.